In Kiev, this is the Sunday show at Hromadske International, the only prime-time program in English explaining Eastern European geopolitical storm, and I'm Natalia Humaniuk. This week in Ukraine has started with the protest against the Minsk agreement, that's how we can call them. And the reason for that was the decision of the Ukrainian government to implement the Minsk agreement. That would be one of the topic, and we'd like there were a lot of discussion in our case, but in our program we would like to show what people in occupied Donbass think, in particular in Luhansk and Donetsk. So that's what you will see later in our program, and as well our reporting from the contact line, where disengagement of the troops, which is a condition for the meeting of the Ukrainian President Zelensky and Russian President Vladimir Putin, isn't really taking place. But why? That's you'll see in the second part of our show, but we will start with a different topic. Of course, that would be another story which stays with us for a while and will stay with us for a while. And we are speaking about the U.S.-Ukrainian relations. As testimony after the testimony by the top U.S. officials from the State Department, putting more light on the fact that the U.S. President Donald Trump team was really trying hard to engage the Ukrainian President Zelensky into the possible investigation of the Trump's political rival, Joe Biden. But what's new? What does it mean, not just for Ukraine, but as the story is growing bigger? I'm really thrilled to have in this studio with me Frank Foer, who is the writer from The Atlantic. Frank just arrived from DC, and of course we have a bunch of questions because every week we got new testimonies. We are talking every week about in this program and everywhere on our platforms about the issue. But what is now the major? For instance, the recent story was just before the weekend. There was the testimony of the ambassador to Europe, Gordon Sunland.
Right. So what's so interesting is that Donald Trump seemed like he was going to be able to. His strategy was to try to block his aides from having to testify before Congress, and that he didn't want there to be any leaks in the dam. And unfortunately for him, there are all these Foreign Service officers, diplomats who were subpoenaed by Congress. And once they received a document from Congress saying, you have to come testify, they argued that they had no choice but to do it. And they didn't even wait to get permission from the Trump administration before coming along. And so Gordon Sunland is an interesting character because it's very unclear why the U.S. ambassador to Brussels should have become the central figure in America's Ukraine policy. And we knew from the text that he had with Kurt Volker that he was definitely in the thick of trying to broker whatever agreement there was between President Zelensky and Trump about reopening an investigation into Hunter Biden. And when he testified, he really did seem like he was trying to draw distance between himself and President Trump. I mean, I think he's a businessman. He has hotels in Seattle and Portland and across the Pacific Northwest. I think he's actually worried that people will blame him for Trump or try to take out their anger on his hotel chains. And he also, I think, probably just doesn't want to be implicated in any wrongdoing. And so he's creating distance between himself and Trump. And we don't know exactly what he told the committee because they're submitting their opening testimony, but the hearings are taking place in private, so we get bits and pieces that are leaked about what's happened.
So could it be even more? Because when we read, even like sitting in here, those testimonies, it's quite interesting for us that you obviously see, you don't need to be an investigator to see that this is the political game in order to, bring some dirt on the political rival. It's not like usual foreign policy. But so, like how it's now treated in DC.
Right. Well, so, you're correct in saying that the Hunter Biden part of the scandal we didn't need to see much more than actually the transcript or the partial transcript of the conversation between Trump and Zelensky, because it was pretty clear what was happening. And then we got the leaked text messages and the text messages from Volker, and that added another layer. And the opening testimonies merely confirm what we already have seen with our own eyes in the primary evidence. And I think that there's this other layer, though, because it seems like there was one scheme, which is the scheme to get dirt on Hunter Biden and to try to get the prosecutor general's office here to reopen an investigation into Burisma, into Hunter Biden. And then there's these other schemes that are happening, the NAFTA gas scheme, this idea that Giuliani's associates were going to try to export liquid natural gas from the United States to Ukraine. And on top of all of this, I think in the last week, the figure of Dmitry Firtash becomes a more significant presence, because Giuliani's friends are representing Firtash and trying to prevent his extradition into the United States. And so the question is kind of, how do all these things intersect? What's the bigger narrative?
So let's get into this detail, in particular about the Firtash and Giuliani, because can you also elaborate more? Because there were previously, a week ago, the Giuliani associate Parnas and Fruman arrested. Then there were some news that also Giuliani himself, the president's lawyer, was involved in some corrupt schemes. And now then this name of the oligarch, yes, notorious Ukrainian oligarch, which should be extradited from Vienna to the U.S., have popped up, and he's also, what I understand, hiring the best lawyers, also close to Trump, to protect him.
Whether the best lawyers or not, there's certainly lawyers who are
with connections.
They're with connections. They use they're on Fox News television network, which is, of course, what Donald Trump watches all of the time, and so they're able to build a certain type of campaign to try to prevent extradition. On top of which, we know that there's a potential investigation into a meeting that Giuliani had in the Department of Justice, where he asked for he was trying to prevent bribery charges under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act to be brought against some. I guess it's described in the New York Times as a Russian connected figure. We don't know who that is, but it seems like he went to the Justice Department to try to argue on Firtash's behalf.
And still come back to this Naftogaz, because it was less discussed than, for instance, the other schemes. So how would you describe the whole thing? So what they were really trying? That's what we found out from
we don't know. I mean, to me, when I look at what they were trying to do, it's what we would describe as a harebrained scheme. It was not, it didn't seem like a serious effort, which raises questions, why were they doing it? Because I think it would be very hard, from what I understand, it would be very hard for Ukraine with existing infrastructure to import liquid natural gas from the United States. Were they sincere in trying to make this happen? Why were they so focused on changing the leadership at Naftogaz? Because that doesn't seem like it's totally necessary to making their scheme, their export scheme, happen. And so when I read the situation, I see lots of interesting questions that I'm sure journalists and congressional investigators, maybe even prosecutors, will be pursuing further.
But what's also happening, for instance, in the places like State Department? Because there is a lot of also confusion that you see those people giving testimony, as former Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch. There would be still the current charge d'affaires giving the testimony. But we know that, what I understand, Michael McKinley, who is advisor to the Secretary of State Pompeo, has resigned. We also hear that the Rick Perry, the energy secretary, might leave, which I don't understand. It's not confirmed yet. Yeah.
Well, Trump said the other day that he's going to be leaving by the end of the year.
Okay, so
Yeah.
so how we see, what is this sign that like so many officials just connected to this story, just trying to stay away?
Well, I mean, I think the thing to remember is that Trump has tried to remake the American government, but there's still a professionalized bureaucracy that views itself as having a mission to serve a country in the national interest, and they're not serving the interest of any administration in particular. I mean, one interesting figure was the deputy chief of mission in the U.S. Embassy was a guy called George Kent.
Yeah.
And he testified that about pressure, about how the pressure to make a deal, the pressure to get Ambassador Yovanovitch fired, but he also testified about Hunter Biden and Burisma and said that he wanted to get the Biden people, when Biden was vice president, to take seriously the charge of corruption and to do something about Hunter Biden's presence in Burisma, and the Biden people didn't really want to take that on. And so somebody like that is not a political actor. He's just trying to do what's best for the United States and maybe even what's best for Ukraine. And so he's coming forward and he's saying, I don't care, Donald Trump, if you don't want me to testify. I'm going to testify if the Congress gives me a subpoena.
And I should just probably confirm that George Kent was working here in Ukraine, and as many Ukrainian journalists, we were able to talk to him, and there were, he knows so much in details Ukrainian politics.
Yeah.
That's the person who knows what is the
Exactly.
prosecutor who investigates the things, who is a good prosecutor, who is not,
Yeah.
and so he won't be really confused as we see Mr. Giuliani, which I would like also to understand
Yeah.
how now he is seen also in DC, and this kind of connection, Trump and Giuliani, because everything which we look now looks a bit toxic, not just Ukraine, but Giuliani himself.
Well, right. And it should be said that he had a business in Washington that was about more than just Ukraine. He was operating in Romania and in other former Soviet republics. And he was so close to Donald Trump and perceived as being so close to Donald Trump that when he would sign a letter for one of his clients, people would interpret it as being a reflection of U.S. policy. So he was inventing, I think, a new form of corruption in Washington, where the fact that he was the president's lawyer meant that he could go off and do deals and get clients all over the world. And if they were criminals, he could go to the Justice Department and try to make their case, and people would listen to him in a way that they wouldn't listen to any other lawyer because he was the president's lawyer. And Giuliani is in a lot of trouble right now. There's the congressional investigation, but I think also there are people in the Justice Department who are looking into his work, and his relationship with Trump is ultimately a problem for Trump, because I don't think that Trump will ever want to get rid of him. The way that Rudy Giuliani behaves when he goes on television and when he's on Twitter, he has an audience, which is Trump. And so he's constantly broadcasting opinions that Trump wants broadcasted. Trump's watching him. He loves watching him.
But everybody probably in this part of the world are confused whether at this stage there is any communication of the other, foreign leaders or anybody with Giuliani. Because in the end, what we had this talk with this phone call, and then we had a scandal. And then many officials who are officials from the State Department, for instance, in our case, Kurt Volker, who left, some others, they are away. Everybody, for instance, the Ukrainian side was communicating. And then there is a question, whom to contact now? Because there are things.
Yeah.
You can't just frozen the relations, because there are many other things.
Yeah. Well, this is...
how do you understand how the State Department operate? And
Yeah. Well, I guess fortunately the State Department is a massive bureaucracy, and in an embassy you have several different layers. I think that when you're dealing with the Trump administration, you're dealing with chaos. And even if we kind of look back over everything that we've seen exposed in the Volker communication, in the Sunland communication, it was chaos even then. I mean, people kept saying, we have to get in touch with Rudy Giuliani. You have the European Union ambassador handling Ukraine. You have the energy secretary taking this outsized role in the bilateral relationship. It must be incredibly confusing if you're Ukraine, if you're the Zelensky administration trying to figure out how you navigate any of this, which is, I guess, probably why they've just chosen to have radio silence for as much as possible and to try to steer clear of this scandal and and wipe their hands of it.
And maybe I understand that there is still the investigation, but the whole story on the impeachment inquiry, how far it is at this stage, how serious it's also seen, because we know that you can announce the impeachment inquiry, but in the end, like in previous cases, there was no impeachment.
So the process happens where you have an impeachment inquiry, and then the House of Representatives has a vote on impeachment, and it seems almost certain that the House of Representatives is going to vote to impeach Donald Trump, and that should happen sometime in November or December probably. And then from there, it goes from the House of Representatives to the Senate, and the Senate has a trial where they meet 6 days a week, and I think it's 6 hours at a time, and every senator needs to be there and sit quietly as they hear the evidence against the president. And it seems extremely unlikely that the Senate would vote to actually remove him from office. So I know this is a little bit confusing because of the terminology. He's likely going to be impeached, but he's not going to be removed.
So that would be the first part, and the Senate takes the decision on the removal from the office.
Exactly.
That makes it, of course, for us, especially for a lot of foreign leaders, to deal with this president, if we're speaking from this side. But really, then, how you see in this period, any kind of foreign relations with a country like Ukraine can be maintained by State Department, by Congress. Ukraine was always grateful for the bilateral support. Do you think that how this also story influenced this bilateral support?
Well, I think it would be a problem for Ukraine if Ukraine didn't. Ukraine is one of the rare issues in Washington where Democrats and Republicans largely are in agreement, where both parties want Ukrainian democracy to succeed. They want Ukraine to be well armed in the face of Russian aggression. And so I don't see that actually changing. I think there'll be some Republicans who will, some extreme Republicans who may try to shift that dynamic. But in the meantime, Ukraine suffers from what every other country in the world is going to suffer from, which is that the President of the United States is in what the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, calls a meltdown. And it does seem like he's always been hard to predict. He takes eccentric policy positions. He goes around the normal processes for making foreign policy decisions. We saw this with Turkey and the Kurds, where he makes a very dramatic change in policy without telling anyone in advance. And it has huge implications for the rest of the world. And Ukraine is certainly vulnerable to the same sort of thing. We don't know what the president's mental state is, and we don't know how that will affect something like the relationship with Ukraine.
But do we also understand in the Republican Party what is the mood is? Because, for a while there was this, in the very beginning of the Trump, that there would be, people that sometimes the Republican experience members, influential members would rebel against the president, but we showed that many tried to cooperate and maybe, be those who are keeping the president in some, keeping that he doesn't do too much wrong things.
Yeah.
But in this regard, is there the feeling that, many of them are trying to distance himself because the scandal is just too big? Or...
I've always had some hope that there'll be a rebellion against Trump within the Republican Party. And it's really, you do see a few Republicans who are expressing greater openness to the possibility of impeachment right now. But, one or two here or there. For me, I go back and I look at Watergate. And there's a wonderful podcast about Watergate called Slow Burn that reconstructs the event. It's very well produced. And what you realize when you listen to that is that nobody could imagine removing Richard Nixon from office until the very end. And so Republicans were defending Nixon until there was a point where they all kind of collectively decided that they couldn't do it anymore. And so it doesn't seem likely to me that that would happen, but I hold out that is a possibility.
And about all these people around Giuliani, like Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman and the others, we shortly mentioned them still. Do we understand how close they were to the White House? Because before we didn't take them seriously, honestly saying, also here, some our other notorious oligarch, Igor Kolomoisky, when the first scandal happened, had said that they are just some tricksters, they are like odd people, you can't trust them. So like that, even they are openly said that they're very dubious people didn't treat them. Now we are understanding that they were quite close. So do you see how close these strange people were around the administration?
Well,
what it tells to us?
Yeah. Well, I think both things could be true, and that's the story, is that you have people who were dubious characters and tricksters who were then, getting very, very close to power. I mean, there's no question that they were close to Rudy Giuliani, which meant that if you're sitting right next to Rudy Giuliani and you're making videos with him, and you're drunk, and you're going off on personal missions on his behalf, then you're right. You're one click away from the president. Then.
And so, are there any investigation we're expecting, or any other arrests? Because we hear quite often, quite many of them. They're not so about the call or about Ukraine, but about usually something else.
Yeah. Well, so last week, there was another associate from Parnas who was arrested. I think that that one of the virtues of the American justice system is that this phase of an investigation is usually quite quiet and is usually done in a professional manner. So we don't know when an arrest is going to come. It just happens.
And also, there were the debates among the Democratic candidates to the nomination, and as well, even Joe Biden himself. Finally, we're also mentioning a bit, elaborated on the topic how exactly the former Ukrainian prosecutor Shokin, who was really corrupt, had been fired. But what it tells to us also how now the Joe Biden reacts on the whole story, because we don't have an opportunity to ask him, though we as Ukrainians also are very interested in this.
Yeah. Well, so, what's hard about the Joe Biden story is that we have to hold several different narratives in our head at the same time, and we have to draw several different conclusions. On the one hand, I think if you go back and you read the 2015 speech to the Rada that he made, it's an excellent speech. I mean, it was really, I think, one of the best speeches that Joe Biden gave. And he, I think, really does feel, personally, a deep commitment to Ukrainian democracy. On the other hand, this is like how corruption happens, is that, you have somebody who might be well-intentioned and a good person who, when a family member or somebody close to them does something bad, they don't say anything. And so on the one hand, I don't think Joe Biden did anything personally wrong. On the other hand, I don't think that he intervened in Ukrainian politics in a way that was corrupt. On the other hand, I think that he never had an honest conversation with his son about the work that he was doing for Burisma, and I don't think that reflects actually very well on his character, that he didn't feel compelled to say, you know what, you really shouldn't be involved with these people. This is a corrupt organization, and as your father, I don't want you to do this. And as the vice president, you're doing something that will ultimately look bad for me because I actually care about fighting corruption in Ukraine. And
it's very hard to get rid of mentioning Giuliani so many times, but in some of the articles we also read that the Giuliani has also as a lawyer, worked a bit on the case of Paul Manafort. You've been investigating Paul Manafort as a journalist for some time. We're the first, as well, to write the big piece about him. What do we know also about that? This kind of I want to invent that Manafort is in some way connected to the story, but still, it's somebody to remember.
Yeah, I do. I mean, if we go back to the very beginning. And, what was it that got Giuliani interested in Ukraine, and before he was interested in Hunter Biden, I think he was interested in the Black Ledger, and that there was a sense that the Manafort investigation, that the investigations into Paul Manafort were driven by the Ukrainian government in order to help Hillary Clinton. That's what he was originally obsessed with. So it kind of, in the trail of events actually kind of does begin with Manafort. But there may, and I wouldn't say that that's the end of the story. There may be other points where, as we start to learn more and details fill in, that Manafort pops up again.
So, Franklin, as an American reporter reporting on the U.S. politics, inner politics, coming here to Kyiv, what is, in the moment, the most interesting things for the American reporters here in Ukraine?
Well, like I said, I feel like we know, when I look at this, there's so many different layers to the scheme. And I do think that kind of the nature of corruption in Donald Trump's Washington is that you're never just trying to hurt an opponent, you're always trying to make money. And so for me, the question of kind of how were these guys ultimately trying to make money, who was trying to make money, that's ultimately the most interesting question, I think, that has yet to be answered.
So thanks a lot for explaining this complicated but exciting, I should say, story. And stay with us. I would encourage also you follow us on social media. Go to Hromadske international webpage, en.hromadske.ua, but also support Hromadske financially. You can donate. You have the button on the top of our web page that would make possible our job, so we can explain what's going on here in the region, as you see. And we'll be back in a second with a different story.